The pack came for blood but found their pups asleep on an Omega's chest, and the Alpha King yielded. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Elena Moore had learned how to live quietly on the edge of the northern woods, where the pine trees stood like patient witnesses and the air smelled of cold earth and clean rain, a place measured not in crowds but in miles of silence, where the nearest town sat nearly 10 miles away and winter nights could drop below freezing without warning. And that quiet was not a choice, but a survival skill she'd mastered over years of being overlooked, dismissed, and gently pushed aside by a pack that never knew what to do with an Omega who asked for nothing and expected even less. Her cabin was small, no larger than a single-car garage, warmed by a stove that hummed steadily and a few blankets folded with care, and on that particular evening the moon hung low and pale, casting a silver wash over the clearing as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Elena moved slowly, mindful not to startle the fragile piece she'd built, her steps light on the wooden floor, her hands steady as she prepared a simple meal, because life had taught her that calm was something you protected fiercely once you found it. She did not hear the pack when they crossed the ridge line miles away, did not sense the fear and anger traveling through the trees like a distant storm, and she certainly did not imagine that her quiet shelter would become the center of attention for wolves who believed answers were found through force and certainty rather than patience. Earlier, as dusk softened the edges of the world, Elena had followed a sound that wasn't quite a cry and wasn't quite a whimper, a fragile call that tugged at her instincts the way a flickering porch light draws moths, and when she found the small shapes curled together beneath fallen branches, cold and exhausted from wandering too far, she did not hesitate or ask whose they were or why they had been left alone, because kindness had always come more naturally to her than questions. She wrapped them in warmth, settling back against the tree trunk, her breathing slow and even, the forest around her settling into a deep, listening quiet, and as the pups relaxed, their tiny forms rising and falling in a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat, Elena felt something rare and precious settle over her chest, a sense that for once the world had aligned into something gentle and right. She stayed there as the night deepened, the temperature dropping into the low 30s, her coat pulled tight, her arms forming a careful cradle, unaware that far beyond the tree line, torches were being lit and voices were sharpening with purpose, because for Elena Moore, the measure of a good night had never been who was watching or what was coming next, but whether the fragile lives entrusted to her could finally rest without fear. By the time the moon climbed higher and the stars sharpened into cold points of light, the forest beyond Elena Moore's clearing was no longer quiet in the way she trusted, because silence had different shapes, and this one felt edged and watchful, the kind that traveled on restrained breaths and measured steps, even when no sound reached her ears. The pups remained pressed against her, their warmth steady, their small bodies relaxed in a way that told her they felt safe enough to sleep deeply, and Elena adjusted her posture slightly, careful not to disturb them, her back against the tree, her chin tilted just enough to shield them from the night air that hovered near 35 degrees and slipping lower by the hour. She told herself the unease was nothing more than instinct, the same instinct that had once warned her when storms were coming or when a trail was no longer empty, and yet this time it lingered, coiled beneath her calm like a held breath. Far beyond the clearing, Marcus Hale moved through the woods with a group that had learned discipline the hard way, not rushing, not shouting, their path measured in yards and minutes rather than emotion, because panic made mistakes and mistakes led to regret, and tonight was not a night anyone wanted regrets. They had followed signs that were not obvious to untrained eyes, flattened grass, broken twigs, the faint trace of scent carried on a wind that shifted every few minutes. And while none of them spoke her name out loud, it was there in their thoughts, Elena Moore, the Omega who lived alone and never asked for protection, the one who had slipped out of pack life so quietly that some had almost forgotten her. Almost. Marcus did not like uncertainty, and this situation had too much of it, missing pups, anxious adults, and the uncomfortable truth that no one wanted to say, that the smallest ones had wandered farther than they should have, and that blame, once stirred, rarely stayed logical. Elena, unaware of the tightening circle beyond the trees, focused on the simple reality in front of her, the slow rhythm of breathing against her chest, the faint twitch of a paw, the soft weight that reminded her that care was not something you announced, but something you practiced, moment by moment, especially when no one was watching. She remembered the way the pups had responded when she first knelt, not fearful, not defensive, but curious, as if they had already decided she was not a threat, and that memory settled into her like a quiet promise, the kind that asked nothing in return. The forest shifted again, branches brushing, leaves whispering, and Elena's eyes opened fully now, her senses sharpening without panic, because fear had never helped her think clearly, and she trusted clarity more than anything else. She did not rise or call out, did not gather the pups or retreat, because moving too quickly could change everything, and instead she breathed steadily, grounding herself, listening past the noise for intention rather than sound. Somewhere behind Marcus Hale, at a distance that was counted in half miles rather than footsteps, Rowan Blackwood moved with a presence that did not need to be announced, his pace unhurried, his attention fixed on the quiet signals others overlooked, the way the forest itself seemed to lean inward, the way tension hummed faintly beneath the night air, and though he had said little since the search began, every step carried a weight that made the others instinctively leave space around him. None of them knew what they would find when the trees finally parted, but the night seemed to hold its breath all the same, as if even the stars were waiting to see what would happen when judgment met something softer than expectation. The moment the first silhouette appeared at the edge of the clearing, Elena Moore felt the shift in the night as clearly as a change in temperature, not sharp or threatening, but deliberate, like a question being asked without words, and she kept her body still, her breathing slow, because sudden movement would ripple through the fragile calm she had worked so hard to protect. The pups stirred slightly, one pressing closer, another letting out a soft, sleepy sound that made Elena lower her chin instinctively, her hand resting gently at their backs, a silent reassurance that nothing was wrong. The figures stopped several yards away, just beyond the reach of moonlight, and she could sense their hesitation, the way intent softened when expectation failed to match reality, because whatever they had come prepared to find, it was not this. Marcus Hale was the first to step forward, his boots quiet on the forest floor, his posture careful rather than aggressive, and when his eyes adjusted, what he saw made him pause in a way no command ever could, because there was no chaos here, no struggle, no signs of fear, only an Omega seated against a tree with missing pups sleeping against her chest, as if they had chosen her without being told they should not. Elena met his gaze calmly, not challenging, not pleading, simply present, her expression steady in a way that did not ask permission to exist. Words hovered at the edge of Marcus's mouth and then retreated, because anything loud felt wrong in a place this quiet, and behind him the others slowed, the tension they carried unraveling into confusion, then into something closer to restraint. Elena felt them noticing details now, the careful way her coat was wrapped, the even rise and fall of the pups, the fact that none of them looked distressed, and she realized with a strange clarity that the story forming in their minds was changing in real time. She did not explain herself, because explanations often made people defensive, and instead she focused on what mattered, the warmth beneath her hands, the trust that had been given freely. A second presence moved into the clearing without announcement, and though Elena did not turn immediately, she knew instinctively who it was, not by scent or sound, but by the way the air seemed to settle, as if the forest itself recognized authority and chose stillness. Rowan Blackwood stopped a short distance away, his gaze sweeping the scene not with suspicion, but with an attention so focused it felt like respect, and for a long moment, he said nothing at all. Elena finally lifted her eyes, meeting his without lowering her head, not out of defiance, but because she had nothing to hide, and in that exchange something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that what stood before him could not be reduced to rumor or assumption. The pups shifted again, one tiny paw resting against Elena's collarbone, and Rowan watched closely, noting how none of them startled at his presence, how their breathing remained slow and even, how their trust was complete. He had seen loyalty forged through structure and training, through hierarchy and rule. But this was something different, something quieter and more difficult to command, and he understood in that instant why the forest had felt different tonight. Marcus glanced back, waiting for instruction, but Rowan did not speak immediately, because some moments demanded observation before decision, and when he finally moved, it was not forward in dominance, but closer in care, his steps measured, his posture open. Elena felt the shift again, this time not as threat, but as recognition, and she exhaled slowly, the tension she had carried easing just enough to let the night breathe with her. No one reached for the pups, no one raised a voice, and the clearing held them all in a rare pause, where power and gentleness occupied the same space. And for the first time since the search began, the outcome no longer felt predetermined, but quietly, irrevocably changed. Rowan Blackwood remained still for several seconds longer than anyone expected, long enough that the clearing seemed to rearrange itself around his silence, and Elena Moore noticed how the others waited without protest, as if some unspoken rule had been quietly reinforced by the simple fact that he did not rush. The night air felt steadier now, hovering just above 30 degrees, cold enough to sharpen awareness but not cruel, and Elena shifted her weight slightly when one of the pups adjusted in its sleep, her arm tightening just enough to keep them comfortable. Rowan finally spoke, his voice low and even, not carrying authority through volume but through certainty, asking no accusation, only a single question about how long the pups had been with her, and Elena answered honestly, measuring time not in minutes, but in the slow fading of daylight and the deepening of the sky, explaining that she had followed a sound, found them cold and tired, and stayed because leaving them alone did not feel like an option. Marcus Hale listened closely, his earlier tension settling into something closer to recalibration, because the story she told matched the evidence in front of them too precisely to dismiss, and he began to understand that what had been framed as a problem might instead be a responsibility shared more widely than anyone wanted to admit. Rowan knelt carefully several feet away, not close enough to crowd her, but close enough to see the details others missed, the way the pups' ears flicked occasionally without waking, the relaxed curl of their bodies, the fact that none of them sought escape, and he felt a quiet shift inside himself, an adjustment that did not feel like weakness but like alignment. Elena met his attention with steady calm, not because she felt brave, but because she had learned that fear only complicated moments that required clarity, and in that calm Rowan saw something rare, a strength that did not announce itself. He extended a hand slowly, palm open, stopping short of contact, letting the smallest pup decide, and when it stirred and pressed closer to Elena instead, Rowan withdrew his hand without offense, nodding once as if acknowledging a choice that had already been made. The others watched this exchange in silence, realizing they were witnessing something that would be retold, not because it was dramatic, but because it challenged the way decisions were usually justified. Elena felt the tension around her ease another fraction, her shoulders lowering as the pups settled again, and she became acutely aware that the danger she had sensed earlier had not vanished but transformed, reshaped into something more complicated than threat. Rowan rose smoothly, turning to Marcus and the rest of the group, and his instructions were simple and measured, to step back, to give space, to let the night remain undisturbed, and the fact that no one questioned him underscored the weight his words carried. Elena listened, her gaze dropping briefly to the pups, and she felt a quiet swell of relief tempered by uncertainty, because while the immediate pressure had lifted, she knew moments like this rarely ended without consequence. Rowan addressed her again, this time not as a subject to be evaluated, but as someone whose actions had already spoken, telling her that the pups would be reunited at first light, that there would be no blame placed where none belonged, and that until then, she would not be asked to move or explain further. Elena nodded once, accepting the decision without ceremony, and in that exchange, something unspoken settled between them, a recognition that trust, once extended, carried its own obligations. As the group retreated quietly, leaving the clearing as intact as they had found it, Elena leaned back against the tree, the forest resuming its gentle sounds, and she realized that the night she had thought would pass unnoticed had already begun to change the shape of her life, not through force or demand, but through the simple act of holding what others had failed to protect. The hours before dawn stretched longer than Elena more expected, not because anything happened, but because nothing did, and in that stillness she felt every minute settle into her bones as the temperature dipped closer to 30 degrees, and the sky shifted from deep black to a softer indigo that hinted at morning. The pups slept on, their warmth steady, their trust unchanged, and Elena adjusted her coat once more, her movements slow and deliberate, because even now she refused to treat them as fragile objects rather than living beings who deserved calm. Somewhere beyond the trees, she could sense the pack keeping distance, not encroaching, not retreating entirely, as if the night itself had imposed a pause neither side wanted to break. Rowan Blackwood remained nearby, though not close enough to intrude, his presence a quiet anchor in the periphery of her awareness, and she understood without being told that he was keeping watch not out of suspicion, but out of responsibility. He observed the clearing with a patience honed by years of leadership, noting how the forest gradually reclaimed its normal sounds, how the tension that had once hummed through the air softened into something more contemplative, and how Elena never once shifted in a way that suggested resentment or fear. When the first pale band of light touched the tops of the trees, Rowan moved again, this time closer, his steps unhurried, and Elena lifted her eyes to meet his, feeling the subtle weight of what morning would bring. He spoke quietly, explaining that the parents would arrive soon, guided carefully, without urgency, because there was no longer a reason for haste, and Elena nodded, her only concern reflected in a single question about whether the pups would be frightened. Rowan assured her they would not be rushed, that reunions did not need spectacle, and in his tone she heard something rare, an understanding that gentleness was not a weakness to be managed, but a strength to be honored. The clearing brightened gradually, dew catching the light, and the pups stirred at last, blinking and stretching in the way only the very young could, unaware of the tension they had unwittingly dissolved, and Elena smiled faintly, a tired but genuine expression that softened her features. She spoke to them in a low, steady voice, not commands, just presence, and they responded by staying close, as if the world beyond her arms was still something to approach carefully. Rowan watched this with focused attention, recognizing that what unfolded here would ripple outward, reshaping conversations that had long relied on hierarchy rather than empathy. When distant movements signaled the approach of the parents, Elena felt a familiar tightening in her chest, not fear, but the weight of transition, because she understood that doing the right thing did not always come with certainty or comfort. Rowan positioned himself where he could see both sides clearly, his posture signaling calm rather than control, and when the first anxious figures appeared at the edge of the clearing, they slowed instinctively, guided by the quiet tableau before them. Elena did not step back or forward. She simply remained where she was, letting the moment unfold at its own pace. And as the parents drew closer and recognized their pups safe and unharmed, the relief that washed through the clearing felt almost tangible, a shared exhale that belonged to everyone present. Rowan allowed the space to remain quiet, resisting the urge to formalize what had happened, because some truths carried more weight when they were not immediately named, and Elena felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and clarity settle over her, realizing that whatever came next would be shaped by this morning, by the choice she had made without knowing who would witness it, and by the Alpha King who had seen not an Omega to be judged, but a protector who had already acted. Morning settled fully over the clearing, the light warming just enough to lift the chill without erasing the quiet. And Elena more felt the moment of separation arrive before it happened, the way one does when holding something precious that is meant to move on. The pups responded to their parents with soft, eager sounds, wriggling free with an instinctive confidence that told her they had never truly felt lost, and Elena loosened her hold without hesitation, her hands lingering only long enough to ensure the transition was gentle. She watched them go with a steady expression, not because it was easy, but because care, she believed, did not claim ownership over what it protected. Rowan Blackwood observed the exchange closely, noting the absence of hesitation on her part, the way she stepped back without being asked, giving space rather than seeking recognition, and something in his chest shifted, a subtle realignment that came not from command but from respect. The parents lingered only briefly, gratitude clear in their posture and softened expressions, before retreating with their pups, the forest swallowing them again until the clearing returned to its quieter shape. Elena remained where she was, the sudden lightness against her chest a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change, and she drew a slow breath, feeling fatigue settle in now that the responsibility she had carried through the night had passed. Rowan approached then, not with an audience, not with formality, but as one individual addressing another, and he thanked her simply, without embellishment, for acting when others had failed to notice what mattered. Elena inclined her head slightly, accepting the words without deflection or hunger, because gratitude, to her, was something to be received with the same calm as any other truth. He asked if she was cold, if she needed anything before returning home, and the practical concern surprised her more than any grand gesture might have, reminding her that leadership could look like attention rather than decree. She assured him she was fine, that rest would come later, and as they spoke, the space between them felt less like distance and more like mutual understanding. Rowan glanced toward the tree line, where Marcus Hale waited at a respectful distance, and he made a decision that did not feel heavy, but necessary, turning back to Elena with an expression that carried intent rather than pressure. He told her that the pack would speak of what happened, that stories would form whether guided or not, and that he would not allow this one to be shaped by fear or blame. Elena listened, aware of the implications, aware that visibility could be as challenging as isolation, and she felt a flicker of apprehension that she did not try to hide, because honesty had earned her trust once already this morning. Rowan acknowledged that fear with a quiet nod, assuring her that she would not be expected to justify herself, that what she had done stood on its own, and that sometimes the most important changes began not with declarations, but with examples people could not ignore. As they walked together toward the edge of the clearing, the forest seemed to part easily, the path familiar to Elena, yet subtly altered by the knowledge that she was no longer moving unseen. Rowan slowed when her steps faltered, adjusting his pace without comment, and she noticed the consideration, the absence of urgency, and felt her shoulders ease in response. When they reached the point where their paths would diverge, Rowan stopped, facing her fully, and he told her that if she wished to remain as she was, living quietly at the edge of things, that choice would be respected, but that if she ever needed the pack, the door would no longer be closed to her. Elena absorbed the words carefully, understanding the weight behind them, and she thanked him, not with promises or acceptance, but with a simple acknowledgement that felt honest. As Rowan turned away, leaving her to the familiar trail home, Elena stood for a moment longer, listening to the forest resume its ordinary rhythm, and she realized that the night had not merely passed, it had shifted the ground beneath her feet, not through force or demand, but through the undeniable power of a choice made quietly and seen clearly. The days that followed carried the story outward in quiet waves, not shouted across the packlands but shared in lowered voices, in pauses that lingered a second too long, in looks exchanged when Elena Moore's name surfaced where it had rarely been spoken before. She returned to her cabin and her routines, chopping wood measured in inches rather than effort, repairing a loose hinge, boiling water until steam curled and vanished, and yet the forest no longer treated her as a shadow at its edge. Paths felt subtly altered, not by footprints but by attention, and when she ventured toward town for supplies, she noticed the difference immediately, the way conversations softened rather than stopped, the way eyes met hers without the quick dismissal she had grown accustomed to. Rowan Blackwood did not summon her or send messages, and that restraint mattered because it allowed the truth to move on its own merits rather than through decree. In the council hall, measured in yards of polished floor and held together by long-standing habits, Marcus Hale spoke plainly when asked what had happened, keeping to facts rather than interpretation, and when others tried to fill the space with assumption, Rowan's silence held them back until silence itself became instruction. He spoke only once, and only to say that leadership was tested not by how quickly it acted, but by whether it recognized care when it appeared without invitation. The room absorbed that statement slowly, the way wood absorbs warmth, and the effect was unmistakable. Elena felt the change without being present to witness it, because it reached her through practical kindness rather than ceremony. An extra bundle of firewood left by her door without explanation, a merchant who weighed her goods carefully and charged her fairly, a neighbor who offered help and did not ask questions. She accepted these gestures with the same calm she had shown in the clearing, not mistaking them for charity, but for a recalibration that required patience on both sides. One afternoon, as the sun dipped and the air hovered near 50 degrees, Rowan appeared on the trail leading to her cabin, unaccompanied, his presence announced only by the way the forest seemed to notice. Elena greeted him as she would anyone else, and he accepted the simplicity of that welcome without correction. They spoke of ordinary things at first, the weather, the early signs of migration, the way the river had shifted its course slightly after spring runoff, and in that normalcy, something settled into place. Rowan told her that the pack had begun to speak differently, not because they were instructed to, but because they had been shown something they could not easily unsee, and Elena listened, understanding that change carried momentum as well as resistance. She admitted that being seen was unfamiliar, that attention carried weight she had not prepared for, and Rowan acknowledged that truth without offering solutions, because sometimes recognition was enough to steady the ground. He did not ask her to step into a role or accept a title, did not frame her actions as an exception to be managed, and that restraint carried more respect than any promise. As he stood to leave, Rowan paused, not to make an offer, but to state something plainly, that leadership required yielding at times, not to pressure or fear, but to evidence that challenged old patterns, and that he would not pretend otherwise. Elena watched him go, feeling the quiet certainty of that statement resonate in a way no proclamation ever had. Later, alone again, she reflected on the night that had begun with nothing more than a sound in the dark, and ended with a shift she could feel underfoot, and she realized that what had changed was not her nature or her place, but the lens through which others finally chose to see her. The forest resumed its familiar rhythm, birds calling, leaves moving in measured breaths, and Elena moved within it as she always had, steady and attentive, aware now that gentleness, once witnessed clearly, could alter the balance of power without ever raising its voice. The gathering was not announced as a ceremony, yet it carried the gravity of one, drawing members of the pack to the wide meadow near the council grounds as the afternoon light slanted low and warm, hovering around 60 degrees and lending the air a calm clarity. Elena Moore arrived quietly, guided by routine rather than invitation, and she sensed the attention shift as she stepped into the open, not sharp or scrutinizing, but aware, as if people were noticing the space she occupied for the first time. Rowan Blackwood stood at the center with Marcus Hale nearby, their posture relaxed but purposeful, and when the low murmur of voices settled into expectant silence, Rowan did not raise his voice or mark the moment with ritual. He spoke plainly, recounting the events as they had unfolded, emphasizing not the fear that had driven the search, but the care that had resolved it. And with each measured sentence, the narrative that had once framed Elena as peripheral dissolved into something more accurate. Elena listened without lowering her head, her hands folded loosely, her expression steady, because this was not about defense or justification, but about acknowledgement, and she understood that clarity, once spoken aloud, had weight. Rowan paused, letting the space hold the truth, then did something few had seen him do before a crowd. He acknowledged a mistake, not in judgment, but in assumption, admitting that authority could overlook what humility recognized immediately. The meadow remained silent, not tense, but attentive, and Elena felt the collective awareness sharpen, people absorbing the significance of an alpha king yielding not to pressure or demand, but to evidence that challenged habit. Rowan turned toward her fully, his posture open, and stated without flourish that Elena Moore had acted with responsibility and care when others had not, and that such action required recognition, not elevation beyond others, but inclusion within the trust of the pack. The words settled heavily and clearly, and Elena felt a subtle shift ripple outward, the sound of people breathing differently, of old conclusions quietly releasing their hold. She met Rowan's gaze briefly, acknowledging the moment without triumph, because she understood that respect, once extended publicly, carried obligations on all sides. Marcus Hale followed with practical measures, speaking of adjustments, of ensuring that those who lived at the edges were not overlooked, of reinforcing pathways of communication that did not rely solely on rank. And while his words were administrative, their impact was felt deeply. Elena noticed how people nodded, how some glanced toward her not with curiosity, but with consideration, recalibrating where she fit in their understanding. Rowan concluded simply, stating that leadership was not diminished by yielding when truth demanded it, and that strength lay in recognizing when the pack had more to learn from an Omega than it had assumed possible. He stepped back then, ceding the center without ceremony, and the gathering dissolved naturally, people returning to their routines with something altered beneath the surface. Elena remained for a moment longer, absorbing the quiet aftermath, aware that visibility carried a different kind of responsibility than solitude, and she accepted that weight without resistance. As she turned to leave, several people met her path with small gestures of acknowledgement, a nod, a greeting spoken clearly rather than murmured, and she responded in kind, grounded by the understanding that this shift was not about her becoming someone else, but about being seen accurately. The meadow emptied, the late light stretching long shadows across the grass, and Elena walked home through familiar trails with a steadier sense of balance, knowing that the Alpha King's decision to yield had not elevated her above the pack, but had widened the space in which she, and others like her, could finally stand without apology. The weeks that followed unfolded without spectacle, yet Elena more felt their weight in the small, steady ways that mattered most, in how mornings began with the forest greeting her rather than ignoring her, in how paths once avoided now welcomed her steps, measured in familiar miles that no longer felt like distance. Life did not transform overnight into something grand, and she did not expect it to, because she had never sought elevation, only fairness, and what she sensed now was balance slowly being restored. Rowan Blackwood did not appear often, but when he did, it was with the same quiet intention he brought to everything else, stopping by the edge of her clearing one evening as the light dipped and the air hovered near 65 degrees, bringing with him no guards and no agenda beyond conversation. They spoke easily, not as symbols of change, but as two people shaped by responsibility in different ways, sharing observations about the pack's adjustments, the way younger members had begun to question old habits, the way elders had softened their stances without losing dignity. Elena listened, offering her perspective without caution, because trust, once given, had proven itself worthy of honesty, and Rowan received her words without defensiveness, understanding that leadership was strengthened by listening rather than diluted by it. As summer edged closer, Elena found herself invited into spaces she had once skirted, not to be examined, but to contribute, and she accepted selectively, aware that presence carried influence whether intended or not. She shared what she knew about the land, about patterns others overlooked, about noticing the quiet before trouble arrived, and those insights were taken seriously, not because Rowan endorsed them publicly each time, but because the pack had learned to recognize value without needing permission. One afternoon, as Elena returned from the river with water measured carefully into pails that balanced comfortably at her sides, she noticed children, watching her with open curiosity rather than inherited bias, and she smiled back, realizing that change, when rooted in example, reached further than argument ever could. Rowan watched this evolution with a thoughtful eye, understanding that yielding when he had was not a single act, but a continuing practice, one that required vigilance and humility, and he embraced that responsibility without regret. He spoke less of authority and more of stewardship, and in doing so, reshaped expectations without issuing commands. Elena's cabin remained modest, her routine steady, yet the sense of isolation that had once defined her days was gone, replaced by choice rather than exclusion, and she cherished that distinction. On an evening when the forest glowed with fireflies and the temperature settled comfortably into the low 70s, Rowan stood beside her once more, looking out over the land that connected them all, and he spoke quietly, acknowledging that what began with a simple act of care had grown into something larger, not because it was forced, but because it resonated. Elena considered his words, then replied with the clarity that had guided her from the start. That strength revealed itself in how one treated the vulnerable when no reward was promised, and that yielding, when done with integrity, was not surrender, but alignment with what was right. Rowan inclined his head, accepting the truth without qualification, and in that shared understanding, the future felt less like a challenge to be managed and more like a path to be walked together. As night settled and the forest resumed its steady rhythm, Elena stood grounded in the life she had chosen, aware that she had not been lifted above others, nor claimed by power, but recognized for who she had always been, and that recognition, freely given and openly upheld, had changed everything.